The boy had been following the river for 2 days, and the river had been climbing the whole time. He walked the bank when the bank was walkable, and stepped stone to stone across the shallows when it wasn't. The water was cold and clear and shallow enough in most places to see the pale stones on the bottom. It was smaller than it had been in the valley. Rivers narrowed as they climbed, the way stories narrowed toward their sources. He had $5 folded in the front pocket of his jeans and a canvas pack that had gone light 2 nights ago in a way he had learned not to think about. The last of the flatbread wrapped in wax paper had been finished the previous morning. He had drunk from the river and would drink from the river until the river ran out, or he did. He had not seen another person in 2 days. He had crossed one road at dusk of the first day, had waited in the pines until nothing was coming, and had crossed and kept walking. That had been all right. That had been the shape of things. He came around a bend where the river bent hard against a black cliff face on the far bank, and the water pooled deep and slow before rushing out of the pool over a small ledge. Something in the sound of it changed. He stopped and listened. The rush of the river was cut short somewhere ahead, not silenced, contained. He walked on. After another quarter-mile he saw it. The dam stood in the throat of the canyon where the river narrowed to 60 feet and the granite walls rose 200 on either side. It was not tall by the standard of the big federal dams he had seen in school books. 50 feet, perhaps 60. Concrete the pale color of old bone, streaked down the downstream face by the mineral bleed of decades of seepage. The river ran out at its base through a low arched sluice, thin and white and quiet, no more than the river he had been walking beside. The rest of the water, whatever the reservoir above still held, sat behind the dam, held there without complaint. He stopped in the gravel of the low bank and looked at it. Nothing about the dam said it was watched. No fence, no signage, no road came down to it from either side that he could see. The trees stood close on both flanks, second-growth pine that had crept back over what had once been maintained ground. A single steel utility pole rose behind the east abutment with a crossarm and no wires. Whatever it had once carried had been taken down long enough ago that the pole itself had gone gray. He set his pack down and sat on it and looked at the dam for a long time. The light was going. He had maybe 2 hours of usable daylight left. The logical thing was to camp on the bank and look at the structure in the morning. He could sleep against the base of a pine and figure out what he was looking at when the light came back. He did not move. There was a grammar in the way the dam sat against the canyon, and he had learned over the past year to trust when something read like a sentence he could finish. The concrete was too clean for a dam that had been abandoned. The masonry work at the abutments was too careful. Structures built well tended to hold on to whoever had loved them, long after the loving was over. He stood. He walked forward until he was standing at the base of the downstream face. Up close, the concrete was not smooth. Aggregate. Crushed granite and river sand pressed into the surface. Rough enough that a hand could grip it if a hand needed to. An iron ladder ran up the face just left of center. Rungs bolted through pairs of iron brackets. Surface rusted to the color of dried leaves. It climbed straight to a small platform under the dam's crest, and beside the platform, set into the concrete face at a height of perhaps 30 feet, was a door. It was small, steel, painted once a long time ago in some dark color that had weathered nearly to the color of the rust that streaked down from it. He could see the outline of it because the setting sun had lowered and was catching the seam at exactly the right angle. From any other hour of the day he would have walked past the dam and never known the door was there. Below the door, halfway up the face, a smaller square hatch. A circular vent cap beside it. The door was what stopped him. Doors were what he read best. A door meant somebody had once needed to go inside, and needing to go inside meant there was an inside worth going into. He did not know what was behind this one. He could guess a small control room, a shelf of gauges, a rusted-out valve mechanism. Any of that would have surprised him not at all. He did not yet know that behind the steel door was a second door. He shouldered his pack and walked to the base of the ladder and put his hand on the lowest rung. The iron was cold. The rust flaked off dry under his palm. He started up. He climbed slowly, one rung at a time, testing each with his weight before he trusted it. The lower rungs held clean. Halfway up, one bracket flexed in a way he did not like, not the metal itself, but the concrete around the bolt gone soft with rust bloom. He shifted his weight to his arms and moved past it quickly. The platform under the door was a small square of iron grate, welded to the brackets, framed by a low rail on 3 sides. He pulled himself onto it and stood. The door was smaller than it had looked from below, perhaps 4 feet by 3. The handle was a lever of the kind you push down and in at the same time. He tried it. Nothing. Not welded. Just seized. He crouched. He looked at the seam. The door had not been opened in a long time, but it had been opened at some point, and the metal remembered how to move. It just needed persuasion. He came back down the ladder. He walked the base of the dam looking for what he needed, and found it in the shallows below the sluice. A length of steel reinforcing bar, maybe 2 feet long, snapped clean at one end, worn smooth at the other by years of water. He wedged the smooth end of the rebar into the crack between the door and its frame, and worked it back and forth until it seated. Then he braced his boot against the frame and pulled. The lever gave a sound like a dropped stone. The door opened inward. He stepped through. The darkness inside was cool and dry, and smelled of iron and old stone, and something else, something drier, dust, that had been settling on wood for a long time in a still room. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust. He did not rush it. Sight came back in pieces, the way it always did coming out of bright light. First the outline of a wall, then the edge of a shelf, then a shape in the corner that resolved slowly into something with legs. He was standing in a control room. Poured concrete floor, walls, and ceiling. A workbench along the far wall with a bank of gauges mounted above it. Glass faces intact, needles at 0, and a hand wheel set into the wall for a valve he could not see. A metal chair on wheels tipped on its side. A tin coffee cup on the bench, stained with the fossil of what had once been coffee. 2 small windows set high in the upstream wall, no more than horizontal slits. It was what he had expected. He walked the perimeter slowly. He tapped the workbench. Solid oak. He touched the hand wheel. Frozen. He crouched at the coffee cup and looked at it and did not touch it. The dust on the bench around it was thick enough to make a print. He had turned back toward the door and was about to go when he noticed the second door. It was in the west wall, set into the concrete a step above the floor, so that a man would have to step up to go through it. It was smaller than the outer door, perhaps 3 feet by 3, the same steel construction, the same seized lever handle. It had been painted the same dark color at some past time, and had held the paint better because the room had held the weather out. He had not seen it at first because a heavy oiled canvas curtain had been hung across it from a rod above, and had settled over the years into a shape that looked more like drapery than concealment. He pulled it aside. He wedged the rebar in and pulled. This lever gave more easily than the first. Whoever had last used it had greased the mechanism, and the grease had held some of its function through the years. The door swung outward toward him. He caught it and let it settle. He looked in. The room beyond was longer than the control room and lower. 12 feet along, 10 across, ceiling perhaps 6 feet at the highest point. Poured concrete, same as the first, but the walls had been furred out with cedar plank, and the planks had darkened to the color of tobacco. A single narrow window at the far end, angled so that it looked downstream along the canyon. The last of the daylight was coming through it in a long thin bar that fell across the floor and lit the base of a cast iron stove. A stove, a cot along one wall, a shelf above it, another shelf on the opposite wall stacked with rows of tin cans, a hurricane lantern hanging from a nail beside the door, another lantern on the shelf, a folded wool blanket on the cot, gray with dust but whole, a pair of leather work gloves on the shelf, cracked at the fingers but paired neatly, the way a man leaves gloves when he expects to come back and put them on again. The boy stood in the doorway and did not step through. He had come looking for a control room. He had found somebody's home. Something in him tightened and released at the same time. He had not expected this. Nobody who found a small door in a damn wall was supposed to find this. Whoever had built this room had built it to be found by someone who was already looking, and the boy had not been looking, and the room had let him in anyway. He stepped through. He walked the length of the floor heel to toe, counting under his breath. 12. He walked the width. 10. He stomped it in 3 places. Solid. He crouched at the stove. The firebox door swung on its hinge with a soft grate. Inside was cold ash packed down by its own weight. He put his hand up the stovepipe as far as it went. Cold, dry, clean. The pipe rose through a ceramic collar in the ceiling and disappeared into the concrete above. He rose and went to the shelf of cans. He touched each one lightly, reading their labels by the last of the light. Pork and beans, peaches and syrup, condensed milk, corned beef, green beans. Dates penciled on the tops in a small, careful hand. He touched the wool blanket. Dust rose. He shook it once, gently, and the dust drifted down through the bar of window light in slow motion. Then he saw, on the shelf above the cot, the logbook. Cloth boards, dark green, softened at the corners. A rubber band around it that had gone brittle and cracked when he lifted the book off the shelf. He carried it to the window and held it in the last of the daylight and opened it to the first page. Riverstone Dam, Upper Station. Keeper's log. Below that, in the same careful hand, a first entry with no year, only a date and a day of the week. Assumed the station this morning. Structure in good condition. Reservoir at half, all gauges reading true. Will run the pattern of the previous man until I have reason to change it. He closed the book. He did not read further that night. He set the book back on the shelf. He lit the hurricane lantern on the shelf with a match from his pack, adjusted the wick, and set the lantern on the workbench in the control room, where its light would not be visible, through the small downstream window of the inner room. He closed the outer door and dropped the lever and heard it seat. He lay down on the floor of the control room with his jacket over his shoulders and his pack under his head. He did not risk the cot. He did not know yet who the cot belonged to. He fell asleep listening to the small sound of the river running out through the sluice below, and to the deeper, patient silence of the reservoir waiting behind the dam. He woke to gray light coming through the two small upstream windows of the control room, and for a moment did not remember where he was. Then the shape of the workbench came clear and he remembered. He sat up slowly and looked at the door to the inner room, and at the logbook he had left on the shelf inside. He got to his feet and walked in and picked the book up and carried it to the downstream window and sat on the concrete floor beneath it in the slice of morning light and opened it. He read the way he had learned to read. Slow. Everything at once. His body leaned in and the rest of the world receded. The first keeper had begun the logbook at some point in what appeared to be the late 30s. He signed his initials at the end of each entry with a small looping mark that might have been an M. He recorded water levels, gauge readings, and weather. He noted the arrivals of the maintenance crew from the town below and the times of the annual full inspection. He signed off after 8 years with a short line. Retiring from the station. Line in good order. The new man will do fine. The next hand was rougher and larger. This man held the station for 4 years and wrote almost nothing but the weather and the reservoir level. The boy paged through his tenure quickly and reached the third hand. The third hand was smaller and neater than the second and more patient than the first. He had begun on a spring morning by writing the line the boy had already read. He held the station for 16 years. The boy read the third keeper's entries with the slow attention of a man reading letters, written to somebody he had never met but might have wanted to. 16 years of a man who came up in the spring and left before the first hard snow. 16 years of a man who noted the day the ice went out, and the day the first swallows came back, and the day he cleaned the debris from the sluice grate each June. He rarely wrote more than 4 lines. He never wrote about himself. Somewhere in the 10th or 11th year, though, the entries began to include, now and then, a longer note. Not about the dam, about the country around it. A morning when he had walked upstream 3 miles and found that the beaver had reworked the whole stretch. A day when he had climbed the ridge above the reservoir and looked down and could not see the dam at all. The trees had closed over it entirely from that angle. A late summer afternoon when he had watched a bear cross the crest of the dam without haste, without concern, as if the concrete were part of the country by then. The boy read these entries twice, at some point in what he took to be the 14th year of the third keeper's tenure. An entry appeared that was longer than any of the others. The handwriting was slower and more deliberate, as if the keeper had put the pen down between sentences to think. Walked the north abutment this afternoon and looked again at the shelf of granite behind the utility housing. There is a natural cleft in the rock there, 6 feet deep at least, dry, cool, and well drained. A man could cut back into it another 8 feet without difficulty and vault the opening with field stone and mortar. It would make a cellar. A cellar would let a man overwinter here, which no one has done. I have kept meaning to build it for 4 seasons now. The problem is that the work needs to begin in June when the ground is workable, and I always find the June work of the dam takes what I have. And by August the seasons have turned and I think I will wait until next year. Below the text, filling the bottom half of the page, was a sketch. The cleft in the rock was drawn in a few careful strokes. The proposed depth of the excavation, the line of the fieldstone vault, a small door of milled plank in the fieldstone face, dimensions in the margins. A note beside the door, hinged to swing outward to shed snow. The boy sat with the page open a long time. He turned it. The next entry was 2 weeks later and had nothing to do with the cellar. Nor did the one after that. He paged forward slowly. The seasons turned. Autumn came, the keeper closed the station. The log went silent through the winter. Spring has returned, he resumed. He wrote as he had always written. Water levels, weather, small repairs. The cellar sketch stayed alone on its page. Nobody built it. The last full entry the third keeper wrote was dated in the late autumn of his 16th year. The knee has gone bad on me these last 2 seasons, and I have known that this coming winter would be my last full one in town. The latter is not what it was. I have been thinking about the cellar again. I have been thinking that I should have built it the first year I thought of it. There was time. I kept waiting for a season that was more settled. I understand now, sitting here on the last night of the season, that no season is more settled than the one you are in. That is a thing I would have liked to know earlier. If the next man to come here reads this, and there is a next man, I hope he begins the work he means to do in the first summer he thinks of it. The dam does not need most of what I did for it. The country does not need most of it either. But the work you leave undone is the work that comes back to sit with you at the end. The boy read it twice. There was one more entry after that, in a different hand. A one-line notation dated a decade later, made by someone who had come up on official business and had not stayed. Station inspected, structure sound. No routine maintenance scheduled. Closed and removed from register. Below that line, in a hand the boy recognized as the third keeper's, though thinner and less steady, a final short note. Left the door on the latch. The stove is clean. The wool is dry. If you are here, you are welcome. The boy closed the book. He sat with it in his lap for a long time. Outside the small window the morning had brightened. He could hear the sluice running quiet at the base of the dam, and the wind moving high above in the pines, and nothing else. The waited for season. He had been doing exactly that. Since he had left the last house at 15, he had been telling himself that the next town, or the next job, or the next winter, would be the one that finally settled around him. He looked at the cot. He looked at the shelf of cans and the folded gray blanket and the pair of gloves paired neatly by the door. He stood up. He put the logbook back on the shelf. He walked out of the inner room and into the control room, and out onto the small iron platform above the ladder, and looked up at the crest of the dam, and beyond it at the shelf of granite behind the utility housing, where the natural cleft in the rock would be if he walked up to look. He climbed up to look. He found the cleft exactly where the sketch had put it. 6 feet deep in the rock, cool and dry, north-facing, the kind of place a summer wind moved through, without ever finding its way into. He crouched at the mouth of it and put his palm on the granite and felt the cold of it. He stood. He walked back to the ladder, down to the door, into the control room, and into the inner room. He will begin the cellar this week. That was decided. He did not know how yet, but he knew he would begin it first. He would restore what needed restoring. Then he would begin. He began with the stove because the stove was the first thing. The nights would be cold on this mountain even now, before the true cold came, and the concrete of the walls held whatever cold got into it, the way a stone floor holds a spilled drink. He needed heat. He needed the flue to draw clean. He needed the smoke to go somewhere the sky would not read as a signal. He took type apart in 3 sections and carried them out onto the platform, and cleaned each one with a wire brush he made from a length of picture wire he found in the tool crate. He knocked loose the packed dust of years, and a small dry nest, and the fossil husks of insects. He wiped each section clean, and set them back into the ceramic collars in the ceiling, and tightened the joints down hard. He built a small fire. Pine shavings from the side of the workbench where the wood had gone loose. Dry pine needles from the platform. 2 sticks of split cedar from the woodpile, stacked beside the grate. Wood the third keeper had brought up in his last summer and never burned. He struck a match. The little fire took. He fed it slowly. He watched the smoke pool and thin and lift and go up the pipe. He went outside and climbed the ladder to the crest of the dam and looked back at the flue's exit. It vented through a small iron cap set flush in the concrete on the downstream side of the crest, 20 feet from anything a man on the road below could have seen. The smoke came out low and drifted along the concrete, and thinned and cooled, and by the time it reached open air it was nothing at all against the color of the pines below. Whoever had built the flue had built it to be unread. The boy did not know why. He did not need to know why. He came back down and sat by the stove and warmed his hands. The lanterns took an afternoon. 2 of them, plus the one on the shelf. He found the fuel tin behind the crate of cans, wrapped in wax paper, sealed still. He pried it open and the smell that came up was sharp and clean. He trimmed the wicks with his folding knife, filled each reservoir, lit them one at a time. The room changed as each one came up. The concrete walls stopped being concrete. The cedar plank went honey warm. The room began to hold light the way a bowl holds water. He rehung the shelf on the west wall. The brackets had pulled slightly from the concrete over the years. He drilled new anchor holes with a hand brace from the tool crate, seated wood plugs, drove the screws in fresh, tested each bracket with his weight. They held. He sealed the outer door with pine pitch he collected from a seam in a spruce at the ridge above the dam, pressing it into the gap between the steel and the concrete surround. When he was done, the wind that had been coming through the door stopped coming through. He gave himself a night of rest, which felt strange, and then he began the cellar. He had walked the granite cleft twice more before starting. He had measured its depth with a length of cord knotted at every foot. He had noted the way water would come off the ledge above during a rain. It fell clear of the mouth by 2 feet, which meant a cellar cut into the cleft would stay dry. He began the work with the hand brace and a set of masonry bits he found in the crate, and with the short iron pry bar the keeper had left, and with a hammer whose head had gone loose on the handle, and which the boy had re-wedged with a sliver of cedar shim. He worked mornings only for the first week because his hands were not used to it. He drilled the granite at the back of the cleft in a rough pattern, drove the pry bar in, cracked pieces free. It came off in slabs, some of them the size of a book, some the size of a plate. He carried each piece out and stacked them on the crest of the dam for later use. They would be the beginning of the fieldstone he would need for the front wall. The dam ran quiet through this work. The sluice ran quietly. The reservoir sat above him unmoving. He drilled and cracked and carried. His shoulders came up sore each night and less sore each morning, the way a body does when it is remembering what it is for. Then the storm came. He felt it building through the afternoon of the 3rd day of his 2nd week. The light thinned. The wind out of the west picked up. The pines on the ridge above the dam went from still to speaking, in the way pines do before weather. He came inside and shut the outer door and dropped the lever and set the lanterns burning. The storm hit before midnight. Wind first. Not the kind of wind he knew from the valleys, mountain wind. Wind that had been running unbroken along a ridge for miles before it found the canyon and dropped into it. The dam took the brunt of it. He felt the whole concrete face flex, not much, just enough to notice. The lanterns bent and steadied. The stove drew hard and then all at once drew wrong. The smoke came back down the flue. It came fast. A thick gray column that pushed out of the firebox seam and rose in a lifting sheet toward the ceiling. He was on his feet before he thought about it. He opened the firebox and pulled the burning wood out with the iron pry bar and set it into the stove ashtray and closed the firebox. The wood smoldered. The smoke thinned in the room but did not leave. The flue's exit cap on the downstream side of the crest sat in a slight depression the 3rd keeper had cut into the concrete to keep rain from running into the pipe. In moderate wind the geometry worked. In hard wind out of the west, the wind cleared the crest of the dam and dropped into that same depression and pushed the smoke back down the flue with a force the pipe could not overcome. He closed the outer door and sat on the floor of the smoky room and thought about it. He had built the fire the way the 3rd keeper had built fires for 16 years. The 3rd keeper had, he now realized, never worked the station in winter. He had been gone before this kind of wind was possible. He had never learned what this wind did to the flue. The boy had inherited a design that had never been tested against what he was going to test it against. He put the fire out entirely. He slept cold that night and slept badly. The next morning he climbed the ladder to the crest of the dam in the pale wet light of the storm's aftermath. He looked at the flue cap for a long time. He needed to raise the exit. He needed the smoke to clear the wind shadow of the depression. He needed a small chimney extension. Not much, 6 inches, 8, that would hold the flue's mouth above the level where the wind could push down into it. He did not have the material with him. He knew where to find it. He walked down to the base of the dam and along the east bank of the river for half a mile, until he came to the ruined foundation of what had once been a small caretaker's cabin. From a time before the room in the dam had been built, he went into it and pulled from the collapsed hearth a length of iron chimney pipe some 3 feet long, its lower end flanged for a stove collar. He carried it back to the dam and up the ladder to the crest and cut it to length with the hacksaw blade from the tool crate. He fitted the extension over the flue cap and secured it with wire wrapped tight and cinched with the pliers. He rebuilt the depression around the base of the extension, with fieldstone chipped from the cellar work, mortared with a small tin of masonry cement. The third keeper had left sealed in the crate. He built a fire that afternoon and waited. The wind came up in the evening, not the storm wind but a steady mountain wind out of the same west. He sat by the stove with the lanterns burning and watched the pipe. The draw was held. He fed the fire longer. He fed it a piece of green cedar to make it work harder. The draw was held. He climbed the ladder and stood in the wind and watched the top of the extension. The smoke came out clean and drifted downwind and thinned against the pines and was gone. He came back down and sat by the stove and wrote in the logbook that night, on the last empty page the third keeper had left. The flue that worked for the third keeper did not work for the fourth. The wind that broke it has taught me what the pipe wanted. Every future modification will be tested against the weather it needs to hold against, not against the weather it happens to meet. He closed the book. He looked at the sentence he had written. Then he opened the book again and turned back to the page with the cellar sketch and read the third keeper's line one more time. I have kept meaning to build it for 4 seasons now. 4 seasons. He had been in the room for 3 weeks. The cellar work began again the next morning. It took him the rest of the autumn. He worked at it every day the weather let him. He cracked granite in the mornings and carried the pieces out in the afternoons and stacked them along the crest of the dam. When the cleft had been deepened to 14 feet by his measure, he began the fieldstone front wall. He mortared each course with cement he had bought in town on a single trip down. Having walked 7 miles to the small mountain village at the river's confluence, and having spent his $5 on cement and a hand trowel and a paper sack of nails, and having eaten a bowl of stew for a nickel at the counter of the one diner, and having noticed on the way out of the town a small library sharing its brick front with the post office. He had gone inside the library. He had asked the woman at the desk to see whatever records the town kept for the country above. She was an older woman, and she did not ask him why he wanted to know. She brought him a bound plat map of the county from a shelf behind the desk and left him with it at a wooden table by the window. He worked the map slowly. The dam appeared as a small rectangle on the upper river, marked Riverstone Dam, decommissioned. The land around it had been transferred from a defunct water district some decades back to a rural trust whose address was listed in the same margin. A post office box, 4 counties east. He wrote the address down twice, pressing hard enough that the words would not blur in his memory, and gave the map back to the librarian and thanked her and walked back up the 7 miles to the dam. He worked on the cellar until it was finished. The front wall stood 4 feet high, mortared solid, with a door of milled plank he had cut from a board, salvaged from the ruined cabin, hinged with 2 iron strap hinges from the tool crate. The interior held a shelf and a raised floor of flat stones to keep the food dry. He put his hand on the back wall of it one afternoon and felt the granite hold the summer's warmth against his palm in the way granite does, patient and slow. He wrote his first log entry in the back of the third keeper's book. On the first blank page after the flue notation, he wrote the date. He wrote the temperature. He wrote the level of the reservoir and the state of the sluice and the condition of the concrete on the downstream face where the winter frost would be doing its work. He wrote the completion of the cellar. He wrote about the state of the food stores. Then he wrote a letter to the address the librarian had helped him find. He was honest. He wrote his age. He wrote how he had come to the dam and what he had found and what he had done. He wrote that he was writing so they would know he was there. Not to ask permission, but to make the situation legible, so that if they wanted the dam back they knew where to send someone, and if they did not, he would keep the logbook and the flue and the ladder and the door. He walked down to town again and mailed the letter. He walked back up. He worked through the last of the autumn and stacked wood for the winter and packed the cellar with what canned goods he had inherited and what he had bought. The first snow came in the middle of the 4th week, after he had mailed the letter. The reply came in the 6th. He walked down to town because it was time to walk down anyway. The librarian had told him he could have his mail sent to her, since he had no other address, and the letter was waiting. She had received his. She had read it more than once. She was the caretaker of the trust that held the dam. She was old, she said, in a way that acknowledged rather than complained. She could not come up the mountain in winter. She would come in the spring if the road was clear. In the meantime, she was writing to say that the dam had been in nobody's care for a long time, and she had not known how to change that, and she was glad. Though she did not know the boy, that somebody was there. She said she trusted the logbook to tell her the rest of what she needed to know when she came. She said that until then, he should keep warm. The boy read the letter twice standing on the sidewalk outside the post office. He folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket and walked back up the 7 miles to the dam. He lit all 4 lanterns that night. 2 of them the third keeper's, 2 of them his own. The second and third he had cleaned and refilled and set on the shelf beside the door. The room filled with the same amber light it had held on the last night of the third keeper's 16th summer. He opened the logbook to a clean page. He put the letter inside the front cover, where the third keeper's cellar sketch waited 14 years for the man who would finally build it. He wrote the date. He wrote the temperature. He wrote the depth of the new snow on the crest of the dam and the color of the sky at dusk. He noted that the flue drew clean in the west wind that had come up with the snow. Then he wrote, "The wait for season does not come. This is the one." He closed the book. Outside, the snow kept falling on the dam and on the reservoir and on the pines above the ridge. Inside the small room, the 4 lanterns burned steady, and the stove ticked warm. And the third keeper's blanket lay across the boy's shoulders, where he had shaken the dust from it and folded it fresh that morning. He sat by the stove for a long time. He was not, for the first time he could remember, waiting to be somewhere else.